two, three.
Hello, Angela. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Matt?
Take two is inevitably better than take one. Thank you for your patience as we had some technical difficulties. For those who don't know Angela, a bit about your background, your experiences, and what led you to today.
Yeah, so I think I'm one of the rare folks who actually studied human resources as an undergraduate.
That is
Although
rare.
fair credit to my dad, he was the one who sort of discovered the curriculum because what 17-year-old knows what HR is, right?
Mhm.
But I knew I wanted to do something business related, not STEM related. And he said, I think this curriculum could be really interesting. And I was hooked from practically day one and have never looked back. And I'm still doing it 30 years later. Practiced HR in really large multinationals, logos that you would recognize, as well as small startups who are just trying to make their way through the clutter of raising money, and then nonprofits as well. So companies at all stages, all sectors, all industries, but always in HR. And it's been fascinating to watch the evolution of the function.
I totally agree. And I think one thing that most individuals who look at the business world may not appreciate is how unique an HR strategy has to be to fit a specific kind of organization. So, the example would be you mentioned not for profit versus an organization in a particular for profit industry, the orientation of the HR department, where it sits in the organization, what it's responsible and tasked for, its key challenges are often very dependent on the company's life stage, the size, the location, the industry. And because you've had such a broad experiences across all different sizes and types and industries, I'm curious, if you look back at the last 30 years, what are some of the more fundamental changes that you've seen in the HR profession as we kind of move forward and advance the practice?
I have been really fortunate that my first job out of school was with a company that had a very progressive HR function, and that was with Frito-Lay, which at the time was part of PepsiCo. And PepsiCo has long been known for having a really advanced thinking HR group. So it was wonderful training. And even back then in the early 1990s, the primary the primary focus of the HR function was to be a key business partner, which meant understanding how we make money, who's our competitive set, how do we win, and what are the skills and capabilities that will get us there. There are still to this day not enough HR practitioners and not enough organizations who understand how their HR practitioners can unlock the potential of their people because they still see us as order takers. They
Mm.
still see us as you do recruitment, you do benefits. It's really interesting, Matt. The other day, I tested Claude, I tested ChatGPT, and I tested Copilot. And I
Mm.
punched in what is human resources? And the answers were almost the same: recruiting, compensation, benefits, performance management, not a single mention of strategy.
Mm.
And for me, that has been the thing that has evolved the most. Particularly for a lot of organizations, the pandemic brought them to the table and have
Yep.
kept them there. But
Yep.
if you were fortunate, you might have been part of an organization that recognized that even earlier than that.
I think you're spot on. And I also think that a lot of organizations, even though HR took on a more prominent role in a pandemic context, the role they took on may have also been pretty administrative. I heard lots of stories about people managing desk allocation and temperature checks and who's got their vaccines and who doesn't. And
Yeah.
yes, that's certainly a critical part of a corporate function. But I agree with you. I think the pandemic created an opportunity for strategic HR professionals to seize the occasion for, and it's probably not the best way to put it given the conditions, but to step up and to offer a different perspective to a strategic conversation that very often forgot them or didn't include them to begin with. So I think your point's well taken. I think we've seen the rise of HR strategy and its linkages to the business. I'm curious because you are a trusted HR leader that your C-suite engages with. What are some examples of conversations that you're involved with today that perhaps you wouldn't have been involved with 10 years ago, 15 years ago, because of the status of the profession or perhaps the companies that you worked in?
Well, again, I think I've been really fortunate to be part of leadership teams that have understood. And for those that haven't, I exited pretty quickly.
Hmm.
But I will say that something that has become even more urgent in the last 5 or 10 years has definitely been around workforce planning. It's just become so much more integral to how do we win? What are the skills we need? And then the make or buy decisions that organizations have to make. What sort of investments are we going to place? on whether we go out and recruit the talent that we don't have, or are we going to take a slower burn and design them for our own purposes. I think in the past that was really left, quote, to the business units to decide. And then again, HR was just the order taker, go get me a marketing manager, without maybe some thought around, okay, what are the skills and capabilities of that marketing manager? At what level should they sit? What's their remit? Really, what is it that they're bringing to the table? Why do you need that job to begin with? As opposed to, well, we've always had that box in the org chart, so now I need to go fill it. As opposed to, do I need that box there? And maybe I need something else that's a triangle.
I think that's fascinating. I think that when I think about broader strategy, to me, another topic that comes to mind is change management. And change management's a critical aspect of HR, especially today in a post-pandemic landscape. And I'm curious, can you discuss maybe some of the earlier or successful change management strategies that you've employed in your career, especially when you consider things like multi-site or multi-corporate environments?
I think one of the best examples I can give is actually fairly recent, and it's during my stint now at Harvard Business Publishing, and that is we completely revisited our value set. Because as we were moving to more distributed workforces, we had a global team that was feeling like they were living on the margins, that we were too US centric. And so we really wanted to honor their contributions by saying, okay, how do we craft a value set that we can understand across continents, across cultures? And so, and oh, by the way, when you asked anybody what our current values were, you got a salad of, well, I think it's this and I think it's that, and it wasn't consistent, which completely defeats the purpose of having a value set to begin with, right? It's supposed to align people to what are the expectations around behaviors, around how we make decisions, and of course, how we treat one another. So we did sort of a top-down and a grassroots where we brought them together in the middle to understand what are sort of aspirationally the things we want to become and the things that we think we need to have. And so that was a really galvanizing moment because employees could see their wishes and desires for the company they wanted to be a part of reflected in what was ultimately the set of values that we came from. And the senior leaders saw the bits of aspirations where we continue to fall short, and they wanted to set a really high bar for the kind of organization we wanted to be. So it went through numerous iterations, lots of filtering, lots of vetting, lots of testing before we came out with a 3-pillar approach, which is we do what's right, we do what's hard, and we do it with excellence. And the mark of success for that is we didn't print it on posters. We didn't put it on cards. It's just invoked organically. It's built into our people systems where people are held accountable for that. Promotion decisions are based on that. But people routinely talk about, that's awesome. You just did what's really hard. And we reinforce that those behaviors are important.
That's great. And I think it speaks to an innovative way of looking at the profession, which begs the next question. You mentioned earlier that right now you're supporting Harvard Business Publishing, obviously a exceptional organization that has a long-standing tradition of thought leadership and arming business leaders with the information that they need to inform their own strategies across many different disciplines, including HR. At the same time, I know that organizations have been going through massive amounts of change and massive amounts of shifts. And one of the more hot button topics, for lack of a better term, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm curious, how do you reconcile more recent trends around DEI and those strategies within a traditional organization, Harvard Business Publishing, that likely has a long-standing method of proven success doing things, air quotes, their way? How do you balance those two things to ensure that you're fit for purpose for the future?
Well, the thing about HBR is that we're constantly trying to be on the cutting edge and see around corners what's happening next. So particularly being at Harvard, right, we were a little bit adjacent to, what was going on there. So we could anticipate what might be some of the fallout and the resulting backlash of DEI. But I think we always understood that DEI was going to be a fundamental business strategy. And now with the changing legal landscape, we're trying to get ahead of that as well and give leaders the safeguards so they can continue to practice what we know will be justifiable processes in the future, right? I firmly believe that DEI efforts and all that comes with it is going to be proven to be better for organizations and better for society. So you've heard it probably a lot. We're doubling down. We do just have to be a little bit more politically savvy to make sure that we don't put ourselves in harm's way, because there are people looking to trip us up. They are looking for us to make a mistake. But we're smarter than they are because we're also righter than they are. So we are continuing to do the work, and we're continuing to guide other organizations how to do it in a way where they can feel comfortable that they're not going to get caught up.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to your earlier point, which is the business evidence and the scientific evidence is very clear. When organizations are diverse, you get diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, and better outcomes.
Yeah,
Better
that's
outcomes
right.
in both the outcomes of the question or the decision, but also financial outcomes and retention outcomes, all things that are really important for businesses. And I think we're getting to a place, Angela, where, you know, in most publicly traded companies, board members have a sole responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility to enrich the shareholders. That is the sole job. That's what they sign up for. And it can be very hard to reconcile that against ESG principles or diversity and inclusion principles when sometimes the money leads you a different direction than what the right thing to do could be. And the beautiful thing about DEI is now that those two things come together, we're getting to a place where I think it's going to be said to board members, if you're not doing things in the context of a DEI best practice, how do you explain the financial implications of a different course of action? Because no longer we have to justify why to do DEI principles, but why aren't you using DEI principles? And that's the shift I want to see happen as we introduce more evidence-based thinking into the practice.
I agree. And I think, to some degree, there's a little bit of strategery
Mhm.
where maybe we don't have to call it DEI.
Yep.
We just call it good business practice around different ways of thinking, outside in thinking, different industry thinking, whatever it is. I mean, there's another way to position it, but what it means is just bringing all different kinds of thoughts, throwing it together, and having the sum being greater than its parts.
It's the golden rule that our parents and grandparents talk to us about. Treat people the way you'd want to be treated, and it really does, lead through this whole process.
So Matt, actually, I'll ping off of that, and
Oh,
I will do you one better than the golden rule.
yeah.
I think the platinum rule
Mm,
is going to be what comes into play, which is do unto others as they would want to be done. So
love
I
that.
recently gave a talk on the hyper individualization of the employee experience.
Mm,
So think about Amazon knows when you're running out of the shampoo that you want.
yep.
And it pings you and it says, we can have it delivered to your doorstep tomorrow. And if you pay $9.99, it'll be there today.
Hmm.
Netflix knows that you've watched these movies and therefore you might like these, right? So there is all this customization. Employers probably need to start doing the same thing. You don't want to become woodchuck, senior woodchuck, king woodchuck. Maybe you want to go pivot and become a beaver. And organizations have to learn how to pivot. A third of employees today don't want to become managers.
Right.
So we have to be prepared for that, right? What does their career development look like? You don't want to lose that talent, but it does mean more bespoke and customized employee experiences. So I think that's the next wave of what HR needs to tackle.
Speaking of that next wave, AI. I
Ah,
think every single time I hop onto LinkedIn, I see 5 or 6 articles about it. It's everywhere on my feed, and that's probably confirmation bias of some sort. But the HR leaders that I talk to are really invested in AI, at least the exploration parts of it, if not the application parts of it. They're either wrestling with how do they manage ChatGPT? Do we let it in? Do we not let it in? They may be deploying narrow AI within their organization if there are certain industries. I know, for example, McKinsey's doing some great work with AI, et cetera. So that being said, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on artificial intelligence as it relates to the practice, and where do you see it having influence in the practice?
so we are having conversations at HVP about how human intelligence meets artificial intelligence.
Mm,
I think it's got to be a marriage of the two. And for those who are worried that AI is going to take their jobs, what I would say to them is AI is not going to replace you, but a person who knows AI better than you will.
agreed.
And organizations who are fighting to keep it out are fighting a losing battle because it's going to sneak in anyway. And there are tremendous efficiencies to be gained. So why wouldn't you harness all of that?
Mhm.
So I think that HR has got to actually lead because it is all about how employees can do their job differently, do it more effectively, and drive impact to the bottom line, drive impact to mission. There is so much to be realized, and I would rather that we talk about how to use it than let it go rogue and and sort of unchecked. Because I think there are so many thrilling opportunities around what it can do for us. So we're having conversations right now around what that looks like and the impact to us, particularly in publishing and media, where I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of vulnerability in this sector.
There's a ton. And I think AI represents an opportunity to repackage and re-engage dormant audiences. I mean, you and I grew up in an era where the information came through a few select channels and a few trusted resources. And now it's ubiquitous and it's very hard to differentiate good from great or good from bad in some cases.
Yes,
And
yes,
artificial intelligence is curation on steroids, for lack of a better term. And it means if garbage is in, garbage comes out. And some of the fears that you mentioned around OpenAI are valid fears. If you are a legal practice, you probably don't want your lawyers cranking out legal cases based purely on OpenAI. If you're an HR leader, you don't want people creating termination documents based purely on OpenAI. But as you also rightly pointed out, there's massive efficiencies to be gained by leveraging AI in concerts with your employees. So rather than shunning people from the benefits of that upside, put some frameworks and some boundaries around what you expect them to use it for and what not, and reinforce the importance of quality assurance or double
yes.
checking your work
Human
or
attribution. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But saving somebody hours of time is worth the exploration of the activity, in particular because I don't know about you, but I've been to a lot of HR conferences and a lot of business meetings. And when I talk to HR leaders and I ask them what they like about their jobs, not a single person's ever told me managing a spreadsheet. But yeah,
Compliance.
right.
Yeah.
But most people are spending a portion of their day managing a spreadsheet, managing compliance, because that's the on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs of the HR role, compliance is the price of entry, and you almost earn the right to be strategic.
Right.
So if you're spending all your time managing compliance, you're never going to actually ever get to the strategy part of the conversation. And I think that's a really important distinction as we talk about AI. I think it's incumbent upon HR leaders, as you mentioned, to really lead this because if they don't, someone else is going to lead this, and they're probably not going to have a human-centered lens when they do so. It's going to be an efficiency lens or a technology lens, and it'll be CFO saying, "Okay, we're going to deploy AI. Cut 18% of your headcount."
That's
As
exactly
opposed,
right.
exactly what's going to happen. Because you and I, we've been there. We know how this world works. But whereas it could be HR saying proactively, "This is where we could embed AI into our practice. Here's some efficiencies that we can realize by role, by department, by organization. And then here's a perspective on how we reallocate the now elasticity of effort that we get. So if we're able to save people, to example, 18% of their time, what are they going to spend their time doing? Can a recruiter spend more time doing employment branding and less time managing an ATS platform? Can a trainer spend more time refining their organizational design skills and looking at new mediums for deployment as opposed to seeing who's completed their compliance training or not? So I think it allows each of our specialists and even our generalists to graduate their practices and be of more service. But if we don't introduce that possibility, it will be distilled down to an efficiency savings, a cost savings, and higher profitability. I think it's a missed opportunity if we do it that way.
100%. Ditto.
So, so from a leadership perspective, I think that it talks about leaders and HR being leaders in organizations. And I think when I think about leadership, I think about the difference between a good organization and a great organization. And I'm curious, when you think about leadership qualities for HR today, how are they different than they were perhaps 10 years ago?
That's a great question, Matt. I mean, I've already talked about the importance of understanding the business. That remains true. And I still see that there's still a lack of business acumen, right? It's not at the level holistically across the function where I think it needs to be. But I think it's also about, and I'm trying to change the vocabulary around this, instead of soft skills, power skills.
Agreed.
Right now, how dominant those have been: compassion, empathy, vulnerability, transparency, candor, all of those things. That was not in the vernacular 10 years ago, right? It was sort of like, you keep your personal life over here, and we're just going to talk about the nuts and bolts you need to do with your job. And now we finally come to realize that all the stuff that's impacting you at home, you carry that forward, you bring that with you to work. And if managers don't know how to respond to their employees in whatever state of mind they're in, they're not going to get optimal performance. They're not going to get optimal engagement. So teaching managers that, yes, it's actually they're responsible to say, how are you? And really mean the question. So I think that's been one of the huge shifts. And so HR, hopefully we naturally have that skills as part of our remit, but then teaching others how to do that. And there's this bias that you can't teach those kinds of skills, and you absolutely can. Just whether or not you want to be coached to learn them.
Yeah, and understand that they're contextual and understand that there's nuance. It's not simply to use our earlier example, a compliance training that's binary. There is nuance in leadership. There's nuance in empathy. There's nuance in managing people. And I think to your point, they are absolutely power skills in an environment where most organizations are seeing significant stresses around talent, and retention is an incredible gift to an organization that's going through change. So it's the ability for us to contextualize and bring that feedback that I think is really, really important. I'm curious, and I'd be remiss if I didn't have a chance to ask you this if I have you here. Harvard Business Publishing, again, one of the preeminent sources of knowledge in the business world. How are you thinking about the future as it relates to organizations and culture?
So this is a really well-timed question. The senior leadership team just had an offsite, and we are contemplating our future. We're contemplating what's our next act in the light of this blazing fast, blazing hot technology. And again, what's the risk to our fundamental business, right? So if you if you type in, what are the 5 qualities of a leader today? Is ChatGPT going to be good enough for you? Because, oh, by the way, it's free. Or are you going to come to HBR and maybe have to confront a paywall? Right. So we have to talk about the ways where we can continue to protect the level of trust that people have in the brand, the level of credibility, the level of well-researched, deep thinking that we are one of the few sources of. And how do we take advantage of AI? Again, we don't think that we can hold it at bay. So we're going to find ways to embrace that. Maybe that it helps us to deliver content in the ways that you want to receive it, which is different than the way that Chris might want to receive it or Shane might want to receive it. So we're going to absolutely exploit all of the functionality of AI to really deliver much more personalized experiences. And I think we've lost a little bit of that when we lost community with the pandemic. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to regalvanize the reader, the learner, the teacher, with our content. So we're talking about it right now. Super timely.
Where do you go for insights? I mean, obviously you have an incredible corpus of knowledge available to you, but when you're looking for a diversity of thought, where are some of the places that you'd go to for information?
So I'm always doing, my intel. I'm checking out what McKinsey's doing, right? I'm checking out what Gartner's doing. But I also have intentionally developed a really robust HR network, particularly coming out of the pandemic, right? As a way to combat loneliness. But now it's just become this incredible source of information, and we're just pinging each other all day long. Like, how are you doing this? How are you doing that? And I have been so pleased by the generosity of other HR colleagues. No one is hoarding information because we're all sort of going through this at the same time. And I think in a lot of ways, we're practicing what we think should be done in organizations, that people should be giving of their time, giving of their knowledge, spending time developing relationships, nurturing networks, because that can maybe replace what we lost now that we're not in the office together. So yeah, I intentionally try to reach out for others to see what they're doing in all different settings. And occasionally I'll look for someone who I know thinks differently than I do. I should probably do that even more often than I do.
It's a practice that I had before the pandemic that I fortunately stopped, which is I had a Friday, I set aside an hour every Friday just for like virtual coffees. And to your point, it was really helpful throughout the pandemic to kind of build, ward away loneliness, but also just to stay in touch with friends that I would otherwise meet throughout my life, but weren't going to meet at the conference this year, weren't going to see at this. So creating another occasion for us to connect. And I think it's an opportunity for us to look at the challenge a bit differently. And I love the idea of technology being a source of bringing people together. And I think that's a great place to end the conversation. For those folks that want to get a hold of you, Angela, where's the best place to do that?
I am the only Angela Cheng-Cimini on LinkedIn. So if you introduce yourself and tell me that you found me talking to Matt, I'd be happy to accept your invitation.
Wow, I'm honored. And folks will be honored to check out your content. You're doing the right work, you're asking the right questions, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.